Hello and welcome, one and all. Welcome back to the Dark Library. We're gonna start off this year by being massive nerds and talking about Kamen Rider, specifically the next series on the list, Kamen Rider Faiz. Now, I'm going to say this now. Kamen Rider Faiz is one of my favorite series in the entire franchise. 5 is a contentious series for some. I've heard its praises and its detractions, but after my own experiences watching the show and the movie, I personally say it's a great series and deserves more respect than it gets. As this is one of my favorite series, I have quite a lot to say about it, so this might end up being one of the longer episodes. So, because we're not going to do any fancy visual tricks or much editing in this, because this is basically a giant podcast, sit back, get you something to drink or eat, put this on in the background if you want to, and, well, we're going to talk about Kamen Rider Faiz. And if you're wondering why this is basically a podcast, Toei. That's all I have to say. If you know, you know. But Toei. Anyway, let's start off by talking about what makes any Kamen Rider series, the suits. Now, I want to say this first off. The Faiz suit is one of my favorite suits in the franchise. I already said this is my favorite series in the franchise, and this is one of my favorite suits in the franchise. The suit for Faiz is basically a tech theme series. This entire series for the writers all have a tech theme. And, well, this is the first one to get away from the magic and mysticism that's been the Heisei era so far. I mean, the closest that was away from that was Ryuki, which even still had a bit of a mysticism theme to it, considering the fact, monsters and alternate realities and stuff. But this one's more tech-based, and it's shown in the suit design. The suit also has some influence from the Greek alphabet, such as the name Faiz coming from Phi, as well as, the suit also having the Phi symbol on it, which becomes obvious in Kamen Rider Blaster form, Kamen Rider Fai's Blaster form. The Phi suit specifically has a very sleek design with energy lines coming from the center of the chest, and this also goes into its transformations to its other forms, such as these forms known as Axle form and Blaster form. In Axle form, the colors from the suit all flow into the core of the chest in order, I guess, to power the chest up for more how fast Axle form is. In Blaster form, the colors explode out with the energy lines basically taking over the black of the suit. Again, this is all cool detailing and shows that all these are basically based around the same design, the same suit, just modified. Which is cool considering the fact that, especially in later series, we get a bit away from that design aesthetic, and the suits look very disconnected at times. Here's looking at you, XA's final form. We'll talk about that when we get there. And I feel I should mention it now. Faiz's forms are more situational than most other Rider forms. Well, except for maybe Agito. But in Agito's case, it was more weapons. But in this case, it's very situational. They also have time limits on them before they revert back to standard Faiz suit, such as Axle being around 10 seconds and Blaster really only used for finishers. Go back and watch the series. You only see him turn the Blaster right before he uses the Blaster finisher, and then that's it. He doesn't do anything else with their fights all that much in Blaster form. It's just the finisher. In fact, up until now, until a few months ago, Blaster was the least used final form in the entire series of Kamen Rider, up until 02 happened in Kamen Rider 01, 16 years later, give or take a few months here or there. But we will save further talk of 02 until we get to 01, in about 16 years, give or take, considering my pacing with these episodes. So next, let's talk about Kamen Rider Kaiza. Kaiza also has a really cool suit. You can easily tell it's a sibling suit to the Phi suit, with its own unique stylings using a black and yellow color scheme instead of the black and red that's used for Phi's. And obviously this suit comes from the word ki. For those of you who play Kingdom Hearts, this word is going to annoy you. CHI, but pronounced ki, not chi. As a fan of Kingdom Hearts, this symbol is annoying to me, and its pronunciation also annoys me. Unfortunately, this was the era in Kamen Rider where secondary riders didn't really get power ups or secondary forms. So we're just sticking with Kaiza throughout the whole series. He just gets minor upgrades to his basic equipment instead of, getting a full on separate form compared to Faiz. So yeah, Kaiza only has the one form, and I have a lot more to say about the Kaiza user, but we'll talk about that when we get to that. Now, for the final suit, we have Delta, who is. Delta's based off the letter Delta. It's a cool looking suit. It's similar to Faiz and Kaiza, but different in its own right, and it stands out the most in a group shot. Unfortunately, the Delta suit is barely seen. Like, outside of series, we don't see it at all outside, like, maybe one instance. We see the movie rider suits more than we see the Kaiza suit, and I find that hilarious. I mean, the Delta suit, and I find that hilarious. I'm not even going to bring up Delta's user in this video because it is that unimportant to the overall plotting and story of this series. Although I don't hate the character, I just feel he's unimportant. I know a lot of people don't like the character. So I also want to mention this here. This is something that I don't think we've done in the series after this point at all. But basically speaking, in Faiz, as long as you meet the right conditions to use the gear, you can use the gear. For example, 6 people throughout the entire course of the series of Faiz, the television series, use the Kaiza gear, and at least once 6 people have used the Kaiza gear, the Faiz gear, and 7 people have used the Delta gear before it found a permanent user, and then found another permanent user because the first person to use it was a villain. And that's not even counting the various manga, novels, or stage shows where even more people use these transformation devices. Yeah, in most Kamen Rider series, the devices are locked to a user, or for plot reasons that only that person can use it, or genetic lock, or some other formality here and there why only that person can use it. Not in Faiz, which makes this probably the only series to use the idea of a masked rider all that effectively, to my personal opinion, because sometimes even the characters don't know who's under the mask, and that leads to some interesting scenarios. And what would all these cool suits be used for if we didn't have any cool kaijin to battle against? And personal opinion, yet again, that's why you're watching this, is basically on my personal opinion as well as some minor recap on the series. The kaijin that we have in Faiz are one of my favorite in the entire franchise. You're gonna hear that a lot in this video. Faiz has a lot of things that are my favorite. And the kaijin group we have are the Orphanox. The Orphanox are a pretty interesting group. They're very analogous to vampires when you really think about it. Monsters who increase their own numbers by killing people. But the Orphanox aren't simply monsters. They're people, but thanks to being killed either by natural occurrences, normally accidents, or being killed by other Orphanox, they turn into monsters. Basically speaking, they're sort of speaking the next stage of human evolution, despite the fact this isn't even the first time that this comes up as a kaijin origin. Not just in Kamen Rider, this is also a thing in Super Sentai quite a lot. Right? The next evolution, the next stage of human evolution turns you into a giant monster for some reason. Okay, I don't think that works out scientifically, but it's still a cool origin point. Yeah. So the Orphanox, basically they work by vampire rules, only, not 100%. But for their designs, all the Orphanox monster designs are grayscaled monsters based on plants or animals. And they also have another interesting design choice that's not in the suit, but in the editing for the show. As their human visage will appear as their shadow when they're in the monster form for some shots here or there. Mostly in conversation scenes, which honestly I shows a pretty cool thing, basically showing the human side of the monster, or the human within the monster. It's one of the little things that make the Orphanox an interesting kaijin species, And one of my favorite. They're monsters, but at the same time, they're still people. And that's a big theme for this show, as we'll get into throughout this episode. So we've gone about 10 minutes in when we haven't even discussed the plot of this show. Now let's change that and talk about some characters and plotting. So basic premise is Smart Brain, the organization Smart Brain, is the most powerful, or one of the most powerful corporations in the world. And they're also the ones behind the Orphanox, or at least the leaders of the Orphanox, as they believe that Orphanox are the next stage of human evolution, and they work to increase their numbers and as well as keep themselves secret from the rest of the world. They basically arrange for people to die. Like, basically they send out the Orphanox to kill masses of people to increase their numbers, or just lower the human population in general, as well as developing various weapons in order to help themselves, such as the various rider gear for this season. That's right, the Faiz gear, the Delta gear, and the Kaiser gear, they were all developed by Smart Brain before they were stolen away by one of Smart Brain's scientists, who secretly ferried them away to his children, or adopted children. These children are dubbed the Ryusei School students, named after their prep school. For those of you who don't know what a prep school is, it's basically private tutoring for college exams and stuff like that. Anyway, the Ryusei School kids are attacked by a group of Orphanox, and this sends most of them on the run for their lives, if not outright dead. And they've all acquired the gear in some way, shape, or form, such as one girl named Mari. Mari Sanada has the Faiz gear, but for some reason that's not properly explained, she can't use it herself. We'll get into why that makes little sense later, but she can't use the Faiz gear for some reason. But she, thanks to accidentally stealing someone's bag, meets a stranger named Takumi Inui, who can use the gear. So she forces it on him and basically forces him to become her bodyguard, as well as the pair eventually meeting Keitaro Kukichi, who gets involved with them and lets him stay at his family's dry cleaning business, Kikuchi Cleaning. He basically is a third, but he doesn't do that much with the Orphanox plot, and is really just bros with Takumi and Mari. I'm going to say that now because I'm going to not mention him a lot, but I do like him as a character, at least in the context of the show. Anyway, the Orphanox obviously are going to leave them alone because they want the Faiz gear back, and they want to kill off the remaining Ryusei kids. So the Orphanox just come up to attack Mari every so often, and Takumi's job is to defend her. Although he's not getting paid for it, but he's just there because he has nowhere else to go. He's basically a vagabond who's wandering around, and Mari basically forces him to a role. But among the Orphanox, there's a small group of them, specifically 3 Orphanox, who don't really like the idea of killing humans. They want to hold on to their humanity, and their leader, Yuji Kaiba, works to find some way to oppose Smart Brain and live amongst humanity. However, humans might not be as embracing as Kiba believes they are, as humanity will eventually discover the Orphanox, and that could lead to an inevitable clash between the two species, which could have disastrous effects. So let's move on to characters now, and I want to start off with the person who starts off the plot, basically, Mari Sanada. She's the Kamen Rider girl for the season, and at first, she's probably one of the worst ones, at least personally. She's annoying, she drags Takumi around and forces him to be her bodyguard, which Takumi does because he doesn't have anything else to do. But she does grow over the course of the show and becomes a more likable person, and endearing because, she's trying to avoid being murdered by monsters. And one weird thing about her character is that she has a lot of stalkers for some reason. Like, among the Ryusei school students, there are at least 2 of them who have major crushes on her, which lead them to do, let's just say, unsavory things. And yeah, it feels really weird for this to be a recurring plot point for her character, that this is just a thing that happens to her. Yeah, it's really weird, but, that doesn't really affect her so much. She herself is a pretty decent character, but she suddenly stops being relevant like midway through the season, but is still around because she's still an important character, even if the plot really isn't 100% about her and her survival at that point. Although, again, she still is important. And then we have Keitaro, who, as I stated earlier, is basically a bro who's always there to be friends for Takumi and Mari, letting them stay at his place and stopping them from arguing all the time and keeping peace between them. He at first really isn't that involved in the Orphanaut plot before getting wrapped up in it later, because the Orphanauts obviously come after him too, but even then, he's really only a defendee, not a defender, if that makes any sense. Uh, but he's still a good character, and brings a fun energy to the dynamic of the trio, at least early on in the trio, as he is the one to keep kicking Mari and Takumi in the pants to basically make them do stuff instead of just sitting around the house all day, which is admirable in his own right. He also has his own subplot that's really relevant to the series, but we have to discuss that with another character when we have to bring her up. And next up, and finally, of the original trio, we have the main writer for the season, Takumi Inui. He's, as I said earlier, a bit of a vagabond, a lone wanderer who Mari just happens into and accidentally steals his bag while she's being pursued by Orphanox, and he spends the entire day chasing after her to get said bag back. There's a production reason why he doesn't come up to her earlier, but it's still a really weird and serious thing that he just kind of stalks her for a whole day, trying to get back his shit. He's honestly a pretty simple person who at first mainly fights in self-defense and for his friends. Well, for his somewhat friends. He's not really too close to them until later on in the series. But he doesn't really have much of a personal reason to fight most of the time. And he doesn't really find one even at the very end of the series. He's basically just fighting for the sake of others. I believe we can sum up Takumi very simply with this line from a particular episode. I don't have a dream, but I can protect dreams. That's a really cool line that basically gives you a sense of who Takumi is as a character. He's not someone who cares that much about his own personal goals, or he doesn't even have personal goals, but he'll fight for the goals of others and their own resolve and stuff like that. He is a really good character, especially in this show, and I honestly rank him as one of my favorite writers in the entire franchise. And that's the third or fourth time I've mentioned that. I said that line. I'm going to move on to our secondary cast, starting with Masato Kusaka, the secondary writer and the user of the Kaiser gear, who is interesting to say the least. If you ask a fan of Faiz who their most hated character is, they're probably going to tell you Kusaka. He, like most secondary writers, even up until this day, starts off pretty antagonistic. But Kusaka's a straight up villain most of the time, not even an antagonist. He's a straight up villain. He's simply driven by his love for Mari and his hatred for Orphanox, which is kind of funny considering plot points. But yeah, he lies, cheats, and steals, and tries to break up the main group, all to either get Mari's attention for himself, isolate her, and or just because of his own shits and giggles. Yeah, he's a pretty despicable character, and that's the point. He basically to prove a point about how dastardly he is. At one point, he steals the Faiz gear to trick the others into thinking that Takumi was working against them. On an interesting note, he is also the only character in this series to use all three of the belts. Like, he uses the Delta gear at some point in the future, but he has used the Faiz, Delta, and he's the primary user of the Kaiser gear. So he's the Trinity, basically. Anyway, he tries his hardest to dismiss everything in his pursuit of Mari's affections, and again, his hatred of Orphanox. Of course, this is all driven from the Ryosei school attack, so he basically has a hatred of the beings that tried to kill him, which makes sense, but his sheer hatred of them borders on fanatical at times. He'll attack and destroy anything related to Orphanox just because they're Orphanox, and he'll attack someone trying to defend an Orphanox because they're stopping him from killing an Orphanox. Yeah, he is such an asshole. His later death in the series is often a celebrated event, and Also, speaking of celebrated events, I want to really mention really quickly Kusaka's actor Kohei Murakami. That name's kind of funny as if you're a Persona fan. The dude loves this role. He loves playing Kusaka. He even set up a festival based off Kaiser's transformation passcode 913, which has become known as Kaiser Day. And he is sheer fun every time he comes back. You can tell the dude's loving being back and being Kusaka. And it was fun to see him cameo again in Faiz. I mean, in Zio, like 15 years later, give or take. But we'll save that when we talk about Zio, because that role, or basically the stuff there, doesn't make that much sense. But we'll leave that alone for now. So let's move on. I should mention why Takumi is a loner before we get to the next set of characters. Because he himself is an Orphanoch. In fact, the only way to use the various gears is for someone to be an Orphanoch, or at least part Orphanoch in Kusaka's case, and most of Ryusei's school students' cases. Which again makes really weird that Mari can't use the gear, because she should also be at least part Orphanoch. Because she's also a Ryusei school student. Anyway, it makes sense. As we learned early on, the gears were made by the Orphanochs. Why wouldn't they make it so that only Orphanochs could use them? And again, the Ryusei school students were murdered by Orphanochs, but were brought back to life as either full Orphanochs, such as in one case, or pseudo-Orphanochs, as in everyone else's case. Again, why is Mari not able to use the gear at all? Makes no sense. Anyway, this also means that Kusaka, for as much as he hates Orphanochs, is at least partially one. Which is something funny I don't think anyone ever brings up in the series, that he is at least part Orphanoch. Which I would just love to see his reaction to that. Would he try to stab the Orphanoch out of himself? Would that even work? Anyway, Takumi, specifically speaking, is the Wolf Orphanoch, and he also was there at the Ryusei School massacre, trying to obviously save the people, not working to murder them. But, because he fucked up and some memory loss here or there, he doesn't remember it, and really no one remembers it all too well until later in the series. But, plot points aside, Takumi is the Wolf Orphanoch, and it kind of should be obvious because of his last name, Inui. As in Inu, the Japanese word for dog. Like Inuyasha, or how Inuyasha's name translates to dog boy. It's, again, kind of funny. Now, we'll talk about the implications of the moment where Takumi is revealed later on. For now, let's move on to the other rogue Orphanochs that take up our other character list. So, obviously, the series has another set of Orphanochs that I mentioned earlier. They're called the Rogue Orphanochs, who mainly oppose Smart Brain and want to live in peace amongst humans. Starting with Yuji Kiba, the Horse Orphanoch, and he's technically the very first character we're introduced to in the series. Yuka Asada, the Crane Orphanoch, and finally we have the Snake Orphanoch, Naoya Kaido, who at first is gung-ho for working for Smart Brain, but quickly changes his mind when he basically doesn't have much of a taste for murder as he believed he would. Let's start off with Naoya, because he's the simplest of the trio. Not to knock him or anything, he is a great character, but he's the simplest. Naoya is the only sired Orphanoch amongst the trio, as he was murdered by an Orphanoch himself before he raised as an Orphanoch. At first, he doesn't really care about being made to kill people, as I stated earlier, but because of the influence of Kiba and Yuka, he kind of changes his mind and switches sides to their side, mainly by developing his own conscience. Also, he's also one of the people who uses the Faiz gear at some point in the series. Just pointing that out, because that's kind of funny. He was trying to be a hero, but he kind of dropped it later on. I think he only used it in maybe 1 or 2 episodes. Anyway, let's move on to Yuka, who... So I want to mention Inui, not Takumi Inui, the writer, real quick. Toshiki Inoue, who is the main writer, or at least series director for Faiz, is rather infamous for his female characters, or what he does with them. He was also one of the main people for Ryuki's movies, specifically the one who introduced the first female Kamen Rider, and also killed her off in that same episode. I mean, also in that same movie. So, in all honesty, Yuka's probably one of his best written female characters, which isn't saying a lot concerning the guy's rep, but still goes a long way. Yuka is a girl who's basically bullied. She's the least favorite sister of a pair, and her sister, I don't remember if she's older or younger, bullies her at home and at school. And after being bullied one day, she slips down some icy stairs and dies. Normally this would be the tragic end and the start of some weird drama thing, but in this series, she's reborn as an Orphanok, being a natural Orphanok. For those of you who can't follow the terminology, sired Orphanoks are people who are killed by Orphanoks and become Orphanoks, and natural Orphanoks, such as Yuka and Takumi, are people who die in accidents and rise up as Orphanoks for one reason or another. I don't think we ever get a specific reason about why certain people do it or not, but moving back to Yuka, after the incident and after being pushed too far, she slaughters an entire gym full of girls that were bullying her and proceeds to run away from home. Keep that in your mind when you think about Yuka's character. She murdered an entire group of kids. Yes, they were her bullies, but she still murdered kids. And also struggles with murdering people. And yeah, it's a big part of her character is that she struggles with murdering people. I say murdering people because she not only kills those kids, but she also murders other people later on in the series. But she still tries her best to be a good person. She agrees with Kiba and wants to live peacefully with humans, but either because of her instincts as an Orphanok, the abuse she suffered being bullied at home and at school, or some other reason, she instinctually kills people that press her trauma button, basically. If they bully her or mess with her, her instinct is to kill them. Such as a group of bikers that assail her in one episode much later in the series when she's trying to prove to herself that she's a good person. Again, she struggles with trying to be a good person and not killing people, but ends up in situations where she has to kill people. And this is also what leads to her and Keitaro having a tragic love story. Basically, throughout the entire series, her and Keitaro are basically email or text buddies through some online website or forum or whatever, and they develop feelings for one another. But they don't know it's them. They don't know that the other person's them. Basically, because they use their first names online and they refer to each other in person by their last names because, Japanese etiquette and all that kind of stuff. And they only find out until later on that the other person's the other person. And then she struggles with whether she has the right to be with somebody, especially a human, considering her past actions of murdering people. Yeah. So, yeah, it does lead to her tragic end after she promises to go on a date with Keitaro, where her struggling with her humanity. Yeah, she dies after being gunned down by the police who discover the Orphanoks and experiment on the Crab Orphanok to eventually develop weapons that can hurt the Orphanoks. How many times did I say Orphanok in that sentence? Yeah, she is the first victim of a war between humans and Orphanok. Well, technically not the first, but the first one to be killed by non-rider human hands. And that's something that has implications for the next character, Kiba. Kiba is really interesting. Again, you're introduced to him before anyone else, and he's the sort of leader of the Rogue Orphanoks, and he presents himself as someone with a very strong moral standing and his desire to be a good person, but he also has some darkness in him. In the very first episode, because he dies in a car accident, hello Truck-kun, he kills his ex-girlfriend in a rage. For context, Kiba, like Takumi, is a natural Orphanok, and he died in a car accident or truck accident when a truck hit his family, leaving him into a 2-year coma. when he woke up, his mother and father died in the accident, so he was left alone. With his uncle stealing his family's money, as everyone believed he was dead. And when he woke up to find some comfort in his girlfriend, she coldly tossed him aside because she was dating somebody else at the time. Now, it is, again, I did say she did treat him coldly. She tossed him out on the street because she was done with him. But, logically speaking, it's been 2 years. She's emotionally moved on and is with somebody else. She could have been a bit nicer about it, but she's still never not going to go back to Kiba just because he woke up. And as much as we like the idea of our loved ones waiting for us if something tragically happens to us, some people are just going to move on with their lives, and this happened in this case. And then Kiba, pushed to the edge, with nowhere left to turn to, transformed for the first time into his horse Orphanok form and killed her when he was angry. Again, he has that tinge of darkness inside of him. After this incident, he was invited to join Smart Brain, or basically forced to join them because he didn't have anywhere else to go. But he does try his hardest not to kill people. He wants to prove he's a good person, similar to Yuka, how she wants to prove she's a good person. Hell, he even fights against the Orphanox from time to time. But, again, he has that darkness within himself, and this becomes very apparent after Yuka's death, where he basically takes over Smart Brain and becomes the main villain for a good part of the series. Hell, he even kills Kusaka and steals the Kaiser gear for himself. Develops the Riot Troopers, a pseudo-rider group, or Mook Riders that basically work as enforcers for Smart Brain, but they only really show up twice, and not counting the movie, that's it for them. But here's a thought experiment that I've kind of always had in the back of my mind when I was thinking of this show. If you watch the show as it was intended, or at least how it was originally released, one episode every week over the course of a year, like you watch one every Saturday, would you have forgotten about some of the details of episode 1? Would you have forgotten that Kiba killed his ex-girlfriend? And would you have only seen a man struggling to find some balance between his human side and the monster within, and the monster slowly winning? That's an interesting thought, and I kind of wish I had the ability to ask people who were watching the show at first about this. But, if anyone has, went in completely blind into Faiz, watched the whole series, and just went into it, did you forget that Kiba killed his girlfriend? Did you remember episode 1 as it happened? Or was this something that you forgot about after, Faiz showed up? Again, that's an interesting question, and I don't know if there's a right answer to it or not, or if there can be a right answer in this scenario. It's just kind of brilliant writing, in my own personal opinion. So, now that we're done with characters, or at least the major characters, we could talk about the Lucky Clover and some of them, but I feel like we should move on to talking about the Orphanox as a whole, or the villains as a whole. And how they're kind of a background element. Yeah, for as much as they're responsible for organizing the Orphanox, Smart Brain is really a background element to the story. Their basic thing is they send out Orphanox to kill people, such as either random Orphanox or their special agents in Lucky Clover. Lucky Clover themselves are really no different from your standard enemy generals, and outside of the sheer insanity of the Dragon Orphanok and the Crocodile Orphanok, who has multiple lives for a reason that isn't really explained, I don't think. They never mention it in series how he can die and come back, he just does. They're really just standard enemy generals that show up in basically every Toei project. And then there's the final boss, the Orphanok King, or the Arch Orphanok. So, I haven't mentioned the major weakness of the Orphanox, which is something that they only mention late into the series, and that is they have a very limited lifespan as beings who are born from dead people. Basically, an Orphanoch will die sometime after initial transformation. They'll die relatively quickly compared to average humans, and their rate of dying, or the sooner they'll die, increases by how often they transform. And apparently, using the rider gear also affects this in some way, shape, or form, meaning that their frontline fighters are basically fighting in hospital beds all the time, for lack of a better example. So, we're never specifically given the average age of an Orphanoch or their average lifespans, but basically every Orphanoch is slowly dying, and they die faster when they transform. And there's only one way to fix this with the power of the Orphanoch King. And the Orphanoch King fixes this by killing off their human side and locking them permanently into their monster modes, which that's super symbolic. The only way to survive as a monster is to get rid of what little humanity you have left. Again, that's super symbolic. But outside of that thing, he's your standard final boss outside of his initial identity as a human child, which does lead to a moral quandary for our writers. Like, do we kill this kid to stop it from turning into a monster? Stuff like that. Well, at least until the king takes complete control over the kid and basically kills off the kid with his own power. So, yeah, the Orphanoch King is basically just a giant big strong punching bag for the final fight. But don't get me wrong, it's a really cool final fight, but still, he's not really much of a character in his own right. But an interesting fact about him is that he survives the final battle. Yeah, he's stuck in a coma, but he's still alive and could potentially come back. If they want to use his character again outside of just random cameos, like they mostly do with their final boss characters that aren't writers. But, that's also very unlikely, so I very much doubt we'll have that ever in the entirety of the series again. Now, let's go over the common series complaints, or at least the common complaints about the series, and that being the communication disorder that everyone seems to be focusing on. The characters basically don't talk to each other about their problems. They hide their problems away until it becomes a bigger thing than it was when it first was the thing. But as everyone complains about, these characters don't talk to each other. The series could be over a lot faster if they just talk to each other about their problems. But here's the thing. That's kind of the point. At least that's the way I'm looking at it. That's kind of the point. I'm sure everyone has at least one thing they refuse to tell anyone about, from their closest friends and family to even professional help. There's always that one little thing you just don't want to tell other people. Now imagine if you were a literal monster and your friends are being attacked by said monsters on an almost daily basis. No wonder people like Takumi keep the fact that he's an Orphanoch away from people. And yeah, that's a major thing, but if he just came up episode 2 tomorrow and said, "Oh, hey, I'm an Orphanoch," how would she react? She would be scared and panicking. She wouldn't even think 2 seconds about, let's say, Kusaka coming in as Kaizen and killing him. But when she finds out later on, it does stun her for a bit, but eventually she just accepts it because Takumi is Takumi, even if he is an Orphanoch. I really like how this is handled and how it's foreshadowed because, again, everyone who uses the gear is at least part Orphanoch. So Takumi being one is a really easy logical leap to go to. And I generally liked how his friends handled it. Basically ending the discussion, again, by stating Takumi is Takumi, even if he is an Orphanoch. Well, except for Kusaka, but Kusaka's a dick, so that's kind of the point. I really want to mention the Kamen Rider Faiz episode done by a YouTuber known by the channel name is Explode When Defeated, where he brings up the irony of all the characters having this communication disorder or this communication breakdown between everybody, and all the writers transforming using cell phones. Yeah, I didn't mention it up until now, but Faiz uses a cell phone, and basically everyone uses a cell phone to transform. And it's kind of funny that a lot of their problems could be solved if they talked it out. but instead they used the cell phones to fight, and it's kind of, again, intentional irony that I'm pretty sure was intended, or at least I hope so. So I know this video is a little rambly, and I try my hardest to just talk about the show without giving too much away, which I don't know if I see it or not, please tell me. I didn't mention things like the police are Mari's other stalkers, or the other Ryusei school students, and I didn't even mention Delta's main user, or the person who gets it before that person showed up, or the rider machines, which probably are my favorite rider machines in this series. Basically because I didn't want to give everything away. I want to talk about the show's ending real quick, though. If you don't want to hear about the ending, even though you can probably tell that the Orphanite King is defeated, cut off here. Even though I just said Orphanite King gets defeated. I mean, it's a tokusatsu. Name one tokusatsu where the villain wins in the end. I dare you. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the ending real quick. Takumi dies in the end. He's an Orphanoch, and he's been fighting all this time. And again, as I stated earlier, fighting, transforming, all that stuff, that limits or lowers an Orphanoch's lifespan. So obviously he would die at the end. And, well, that's the ending. He dies. It's no wonder he's on his last legs by the finale, despite all the retcons that happen later for him to show up in the Tyson movies. Oh god, we'll talk about those movies when we get there, and some other stuff. But yeah, Takumi dies in the end, and it's a poignant death. He dies believing in the future for him and his friends, and it's a sad ending for him as a person, but it's still a good ending in the case of the series, because he died with a smile on his face before he turned into dust. Yeah, basically if you're killed by an Orphanoch, / if you die as an Orphanoch, you don't leave a corpse behind, you just turn into dust. So, yeah. And it's a poignant ending, and I love it. God, I hate the Tyson movies and how they retconned this ending. But yeah. That is Kamen Rider Faiz, one of my favorite Rider series. And I know this video is long, we're going on close to 50 minutes as I'm talking. And I'm grateful if you made it this far in. Like, if you stuck around for the whole video, even if you just put this in the back of your mind, or just, like, put this on in the background while you did other shit, I'm really happy that you've listened to me this far. I hope my love for the series reached out to you and maybe inspired you to maybe take a peek at this little show. Again, it's one of my favorites, and I want to share with everyone I possibly can. And yeah, there are other things like manga and movies and light novels. And there's also a recent manga about Kaiser that was released in 2019, which I find kind of funny. But Faiz will always have a place in my heart. I find myself loving these characters and their stories and how relatable that they all are. The Orphanochs are some of the best kaijin in the franchise, and I'll never hear anything against them. And that's all I have to say about Faiz. I mean, I could talk more about Faiz, but again, spoilers. Well, yeah, except for one little thing. I want to talk about the movie. The Kamen Rider Faiz movie specifically, because it's one of my favorite Kamen Rider movies. So, if you thought this one was maybe too long, buckle up, buddy, because we're gonna dive into another. It probably won't be that as long as this one, because we're only gonna talk about a movie and not a whole close to 50 episode series. And we're gonna be talking about Kamen Rider Faiz Lost Paradise next time. So I hope to see you all there. Or some new people potentially. Until then, everybody.